And we are live. Greetings, salutations, and all that jazz, and welcome to another episode of the World Anvil World Building Podcast live. And what guest do I have for you today? Trent and Stephen, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invite.
Really happy to be here.
Well, Trent Hergenrader, Dr. Trent Hergenrader, I should say, is a long-time guest of the World Anvil stage, World Anvil podcast. I think you've been at the World Building Con as well. It's always such a pleasure to have you here. And he is a real-life world building professor, guys. It's very, very cool. Trent, can you tell the boys and girls at home just a little bit about what you do?
Sure. I am a professor in the Department of English. I teach creative writing classes, and the two classes that I teach most often is one called World Building Workshop, in which we use World Anvil to break students into groups, and then they collaboratively build worlds. And the other one that I teach on regular rotation is called game-based fiction, in which we will either do a little world building or take a setting in a tabletop role-playing game and then use those role-playing games to generate plot lines for unique characters. So that's what I get to do. It sounds way better than it actually is. Like, that's the best part of my day, right? That my best part of my day of these classes. And then, I'm doing paperwork and advising and doing all these other things. So, but still, I'll take it, I guess.
Right. So Trent is the associate professor in the Department of English and the director of the Center for World Building and Storytelling. How cool is that, guys? He's also the co-author of the World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulations and Games, which you guys should totally check out. theworldbuildingworkshop.com will get you there. Very, very cool stuff. And is also the author of one of my absolute favorite world building books that I always recommend. That's Collaborative World Building for Writers and Gamers. Massive recommend on that, guys. It is just like a step-by-step methodology masterpiece. Love. He, of course, teaches, as you have heard. He has also written much in the academic space. And he's also a published fiction writer whose work has appeared in fantasy and science fiction, Weird Tales, Mammoth Book of Dieselpunk, among other places, and has been reprinted in Best Horror of the Year, number one, Trent.
Number one, that's right.
Amazing. And of course, we have Stephen. Stephen, could you tell us just a little bit about what it is you do?
I can. So I'm a learning scientist. I formerly was a professor like Trent. I had a really interesting job where I was divided between the University of Connecticut's School of Education and their School of Fine Arts. So I had one foot teaching pre- and in-service teachers about educational technology and instructional design and game design. And then the other side of my job was teaching future game designers, interactive storytellers, web developers, that sort of thing. And now I do instructional design. I lead business process and training development for CVS Health's subsidiary Quorum. That's not why I'm here today. We're not going to talk about enteral and infusion therapy, but it pays the bills, so there's that. But I spend a lot of time talking to Trent about world building stuff. We've known each other for, we think, about 15, 16 years at this point. It was love at first sight when we met at the Games Learning and Society conference back in 2011. And ever since then, we've been good old chums, just talking about world building, complaining about politics, figuring out how to write this book. And I'm really glad to be here with him today.
All that fun stuff. So you also have a PhD. You're also Dr. Stephen Slota from the University of Connecticut, and as well as working for a ton of very cool organizations: CVS, Arizona State University, University of Connecticut, Pfizer is a name I haven't heard in a while since the before times. You have also authored many academic articles, including "Are Princesses in Another Castle?" Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
I can. That paper was the consequence of a class that we ran back in about 2010. My advisor, Michael Young, decided I want to run this one credit seminar where we're just going to look at games in education. And this was right around the time where there was this huge surge in people who were really curious about play and its applications in learning environments. So we said, let's take a look at all the literature that's been written about this. And we compiled it all and analyzed it and did this meta-analysis, the first of its kind for the review of ed research. And what we ended up finding, I think the single most important takeaway was that people needed to stop asking the question, were games good or bad for education? It turns out it's really context dependent and situated. And we were looking specifically at academic disciplines like math and English and history, but we could see all of these opportunities to leverage playful learning in these spaces to do all kinds of interesting stuff. And it really was born out of this scholarly history of anchored instruction or inquiry-driven instruction, where you use storytelling as the foundation for people to make sense of the world that they occupy. And I kind of think of that as being the etude that led to the point of writing the World Building Workshop. I mean, that's not to, Trent was not part of that particular project, but it was one of the things that got me super interested in world building and interactive storytelling as a framework for education. And so, you know, over the last 16 years or so, the two of us have really put our heads together to figure out what is it about these specific tools that works for education. And I don't mean just K through 12 or high school, you know, college education, but also corporate environments or healthcare, the military, nonprofits. Why aren't we doing more storytelling in these spaces? And if we're going to do that, what should it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I have somebody, a friend, also a university professor, who works with the Defense Department in the UK on disaster preparedness, and they use storytelling and role-playing games to do this. Actually, they use WorldAnvil for this, which is also quite cool. So just so you know, there is already great hunger for the World Building Workshop, my friends. Does it come in PDF? Where can I get a digital book? Asks Cottage of Connie. So before we've even got into our topic today, tell us a little bit more about the World Building Workshop.
So if you go to the worldbuildingworkshop.com, there are links out to different sellers who have it. MIT Press has their own bookstore, and I can't remember the code. I'll get it when I go check my other social media, but there's a 20% off code if you want to get a physical copy. If you'd like a PDF, just put in a note to the contact form that we have, send a message, and I'll reach out to you and let you know how you can get one. I think there is a Kindle version or some sort of ebook version on Amazon, although I don't have that specific version, but we can find a PDF for you if you want one.
Hooray. So folks, that's how you can get that. And I haven't read this one yet, but having read Trent's previous work, I can say, yes, it's on my list now.
We also have forthcoming, we have an audiobook version. So I've read the entire book out loud, and we're producing that to put out, and it will be available on Audible as well as through our website. Our website will be significantly less expensive because Audible takes a huge chunk of the money when you try to sell something through there. So that'll just be my recommendation is if you're interested in an audio version read by me, that will be there on our website forthcoming over the next couple of months.
Amazing. So our topic today is speculative fiction with a side order of hope. We are talking about hope punk, hopeful speculative fiction in general. And as always with these kinds of things, I think it's a very useful thing to start with, but what is it? So what are your thoughts, guys? How do we define hopeful speculative fiction? What's in that box? What are your thoughts, Trent?
Yeah, so I would say for me, lots of fiction, even something like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, it's very dystopian, very, crushingly hard to read in parts. But there's also a sense of we can change this, right? We can, and this is where it's funny because when I first started doing world building, students really didn't want to make a world where it's like, we don't want to have racism, we don't want to have sexism, we don't want to have bigotry. And it's like, okay, but where are the conflicts going to be in your world, right? So this is really one of the things that I always think about when we're talking about world building and breaking it down, breaking down the systems. Like, where are the pressure points? What are the points that make people's lives miserable? And then can we think critically about how we can alleviate that? Because this is where, too, I took a seminar when I was in graduate school on utopian and dystopian literature. And there's not a great volume of utopian literature because almost the only thing that can be the core problem is the utopia is threatened, right? So that gets old kind of quickly. But of course, there's things like The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, which is really, really good. And that sort of shows one of the things that I think is important too. And when you're thinking about hopeful spec fic and what does it mean to have a utopia, your utopia is going to be somebody else's dystopia, right? So no matter what happens, there's always going to be differences of opinion. Differences of opinion create conflict, and conflict is a great engine for storytelling. So that's where even if your world is hopeful, right? Like I'm thinking Kim Stanley Robinson also wrote the Three Californias trilogy, which I highly recommend for all world builders, where he takes 3 different looks at sort of what a futuristic Southern California might look like. It's a post-apocalyptic, dystopian, and then the last one is utopian. I believe it's called Pacific Edge, and it's quite good. And it's one of those things where there's some challenges in the community that they're trying to develop, and there's some interpersonal conflicts, but it's basically like, they've got green energy and everyone gets along, but there's still people who want to monetize things, and whatever. So there are plenty of problems in that world. But I would just say, looking at a world that there's a way out, even if it's just a glimmer of hope, is something to then isolate and then try and build around and say, how can I find a glimmer of hope in my own circumstances and maybe work towards it?
Yeah, very cool. What is your thoughts, Stephen, on what goes into this sort of hopeful speculative fiction bracket? Are there any sort of subgenres that you think particularly apply here?
Yeah, I think a lot about this in terms of historical fiction, or even how we can set stories in our lived reality, because I'm coming at this from the perspective of an educator. I was a high school teacher. I then became a college professor focused on educational technology and psychology. And my day job for 15 years has been instructional design. So I'm always asking the question, what am I doing to communicate to an audience about how the world could or should be? So you can frame hopeful speculative fiction as being something that's obviously fictional, but there are all these applications that are non-fictional. And Trent and I talk at length about the Star Wars TV show Andor, which I don't know that you would necessarily pin as being hopeful, except that it does set up the framework for how to resist a fascist totalitarian regime. And I, as somebody who has spent a lot of time reading history, looks at that and says, there is something hopeful about that, right? That you're just same thing that Trent was just saying about The Handmaid's Tale, or you could point to the Hunger Games or any number of other stories where they are dystopic, but the point of them is to help you figure out how to, there's the saying that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. We prefer the Jon Stewart version of that, which is the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but you have to bend it. And so we're thinking all the time about how do you do that bending part, right? Where are the pressure points that you can apply your own platform, your own knowledge, your own expertise in a way that's going to make the world into the image of what you think it could or should be. So when I would teach future teachers, when I would teach game designers about this, I tried to get them to step back and not think about this as being utopic or dystopic, because like Trent said, somebody's utopia is somebody else's dystopia and vice versa. What we really need to be thinking about is what is, and how do we get to what you want to be. So when you're working on speculative fiction, really, I would recommend thinking through what is the message I want to be sending to my audience? What is the learning objective that's associated with this? And then what can I do through the interactions or points of tension between characters that's going to illustrate to my audience how they can or should move in that specific direction?
Yeah, very, very interesting. Funny that you mentioned Andor. It was on my list. I mean, the whole of Star Wars, I mean, there's a reason that there's an issue called The New Hope, right? It's all about hope.
Yep.
And I feel like it fits very nicely within this hopeful speculative fiction bracket, even though the world of Andor is very, very dark. It's about resisting that darkness.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about positioning the cozy space within hopeful spec fic? Do you think that has a place within hopeful, and why?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think this is where, too, like, thinking is even when Steve and I do our podcast, it's the same thing. He starts talking and then I start thinking about all the things that I want to respond to. But, one of the things that in the collaborative world building book, and we do this in the world building workshop as well, is thinking about world building in terms of scope, sequence, and perspective. So you're not talking about an entire planet or an entire country or even an entire city. You're talking about a pocket that you're trying to create where it's like, what are the social forces sort of in this time? And in this space, because like we're looking at Star Wars, well, there was an era before the Civil War. There's an era after the Galactic Civil War, right? And it's like, so when on the timeline, and who are you looking at, right? Like what is the specific world that you're looking at? But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things too that I'm seeing with college students now is the world is, there's information overload. We're getting bombarded, especially in the United States, advertisements, everything, TVs everywhere. You need to figure out how can you do some self-care and figure out where can I find a moment of peace doing something, right? And this is where I think a lot of tabletop gaming is coming back in a big way because people are finding we're going to shut off the phones, we're going to shut off the TVs, and we're just going to enjoy a human experience. And I think that it's always, that's one of those things that can actually be quite surprising in fiction, is someone finds a moment of peace in otherwise a chaotic realm, right? And I think it's instructive in that sense that maybe you can do that too, right? Like maybe your piece is going to look very different based on the world that you're living in, but we all can find that. But even just kind of thinking through, like, how does someone define what that does for them? What does it mean when you're feeling like it's restorative or something like that? And that's where too, I'm not very good. I tend to be a dark fiction kind of writer. But it's one of those things that whenever I see like a moment of happiness, a moment of hope, it sticks with me because it's so often doom and gloom sort of all the time. And I think that even just a small moment, to use one example from my own life, this past fall semester, 3 or 4 other professors and I were playing a table. We'd take an hour and we would play a tabletop role-playing game in the middle of the day. I'd reserve a room. We would go to the room. We would play Vaesen by Free League, which is one of my favorite tabletop role-playing games. And that 1 hour did so much for my mental health and positive outlook and whatever. And we fell out of the schedule in the spring semester. And it's like, man, I miss it so much because just having that moment that we were like, no meetings, no phones, no nothing, right? That was our little hopeful moment that maybe, we're not going to be drowned by bureaucracy. So yeah, so I think that those are all things that stick out, right? If somebody can find that and fight for that, and that's fighting the good fight, so to speak.
With respect to cozy genre elements too, I think, cozy reminds me of Animal Crossing, Stardew Valley, that sort of thing, right? And just because it has the cozy aesthetic doesn't necessarily mean that the message has to be hopeful or unhopeful, right? Hopeful or despairing, whatever. That you, as Trent said, you find those points of tension. And I think your phrase, Trent, is finding the spark. So you create sparks in that environment and figure out what is the tension there. Because even a romance novel has some elements that are hopeful and despairing, right? Some of the best literature I've ever read has had both elements baked in there. And I think that's reflective of the human experience of having peaks and valleys, right? You experience grief, but you also experience that joy. And being able to figure out how to embed that in a way that feels meaningful and richly authentic is super important. And this kind of gets lost when you're developing, instructional materials for a corporate professional development environment, right? But one of the arguments I've made to my colleagues in this large corporate entity is that, well, the human stuff is what actually matters. The rest of it is not so important. And they'll typically pretend or talk about training and instructional design as being teach people how to push a button so they push the button correctly. And my argument to them is that's not really the point. The point is to get at all of these other human issues like interpersonal communication and problem solving, persuasion, even just being able to understand one another better, which is something that, Trent and I have spent a lot of time in our own conversations complaining about or discussing AI, generative AI. And one of the things it can't do is be human, right? There are all these opportunities to do this kind of storytelling in a way that seeds in the human elements that an AI can't because it doesn't have knowledge or context or experience. It's just, for all intents and purposes, a form of autofill, right? Like it's a very complicated black box autofill, and it can't prescribe to anyone what a human experience is going to be. So I saw the comment just now about Stardew Valley being about capitalism, right? I agree. I think that's exactly kind of what the thrust of that narrative is, but it's embedded in such a way that the story feels personal to you as the player. You are the one that is changing the world in this way that is anti-capitalist. And I think that's the same kind of message that you see in something like Andor, where you are the audience being taught by the person, in that case, Tony Gilroy and all the other folks who helped create that show, about what it is to find hope in these environments where it may be scarce. And Stardew Valley has a very bright, hopeful aesthetic to it, but you could just as easily be telling that story in the world of The Last of Us. It just matters how you've decided to frame the characters and the structure of the narrative you're creating.
Yeah, and the stakes, I guess, as well.
The stakes,
so big part of that. I think that actually moves us very nicely onto this next question. What makes a setting hopeful? We will explore plot and various other things because I think that I have thoughts on that space, but we're in world building. What makes a setting hopeful? Now, Trent, you sort of led with this idea that there must be some kind of conflict. Do you think that that has a sort of direct impact on the hopefulness, shall we say, of a setting?
Yeah, and I think that this is where too, like thinking about storytelling specifically, and this is something that I always get into with my students as well. I really encourage them to keep storytelling and world building separate, because a setting is going to be depicted as either hopeful or despairing based on the perspective of the person who is telling the story, right? So, you know, it could be hopeful if you're a stormtrooper who's hoping to get a promotion, right? Like, oh yeah, well, you know, this mass genocide, that could get me a, you know, promotion or whatever, right? Like, so thinking about what I always try and encourage my students to do is use a neutral point of view, that the world is neither good nor bad. These features just exist, and reasonable people will look at that and say, yes, that is true, right? There is an authoritarian government and people have few, you know, rights, or vice versa, right? It is a very pluralistic and open society. And then when you're telling the stories, you decide through the perspective of your character whether that world is hopeful or whether that world is not. But the world should just kind of be, right? Like, I don't find our world particularly hopeful, and I don't really find it particularly negative. I feel like we have lots of opportunities, and unfortunately, because I am a cynic, we often take the you know, the most capitalistic driven, you know, like money, especially in the United States, money is the thing that tends to drive people's decision making, unfortunately, which I don't find very hopeful. But, you know, if you're a capitalist, then this is the place to be, right? Like, you see hope all around. AI is hopeful, right? You know what I mean? Like, maybe I can replace all of my employees. Well, that wouldn't be my instinct, right? But that it could be hopeful for that particular perspective.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Go ahead, please, Stephen.
I was just going to pin on to the end of that this idea of neutrality being that there is no good guys or bad guys, right? That's all just, Trent and I have talked pretty extensively about why we don't really love the Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart. Not because it's not useful, right? But it's just reductive, because people are complicated and their decision making is nuanced. And I try to, whenever I was doing this with my own students, I would suggest to them, think about the incentive structures that are driving people's behavior, because it's not just I am inherently good or I am inherently bad. I don't think any human is inherently good or bad, but they are the inheritors of circumstance. And so the things that have happened to them, the environments they've fostered, the reinforcement they're getting, right? Again, this comes back to sort of learning theory and educational psychology. How does a person's cognition reflect the circumstances under which they have been raised and then they live their life? We talk a lot about life worlds or lived experiences, the idea that you're going to be reinforced by the surrounding environment. So it's going to drive you towards certain incentive structures that are then going to be facts of the matter, things that happen in the world. That is an objective reality. Now we have to step back and say, subjectively, as Trent was saying, from the perspective of another person, why would that person perceive that other individual the way they are? And that it's not as simple as they are a bad, evil, capitalist, greedy corporate leader. It's that that person has these other incentives and motives that are being driven by these other expectations that have been layered on over the course of months or years or decades. And we really have to do a lot to disentangle what is it that makes a person make a specific decision in a specific moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, I think. That it is deeply complex. And to Trent's point, hopeful for whom? Question mark. Now, Trent, you talked about the sparks. Can you identify between you some of the things that you can sprinkle into a world to set up this kind of hope? And what are the levers you can pull to get from, you know, Stardew Valley to Andor and back again, right?
Right.
Like what are the sliding scales? What are the tools that we're using as world builders, and that we can sort of experiment with to create different spaces that still have this sort of opportunity to tell hopeful stories?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is where too, it's again, this whole idea of like world building, for me at least, world building and narrative need to be separate, because you're telling the world, you're trying to just say how the world is, unless you're writing it from a very, you know, like you're a hermit who's, you know, writing the world or what, you know, writing the story of the world or whatever, which could be very, very subjective. But I think there's more storytelling potential by moving back and being like, this is just the way that the world is, and there's always going to be some form of conflict. So I was just running through this with my students, where we do something called rapid story prototyping, in which they'll build a world using my card deck real fast, and then they'll build 3 characters, and then I say, tell me a story about these 3 characters, because the conflict could be between the characters, the conflict could be between the character and the world, or one character in the world and another character and the other character, right? So just thinking about the ways, and it doesn't always, whenever, I have also said too, like when I go to AWP, which is the big creative writing program, and people know that I teach genre fiction, speculative fiction, or whatever. There has to be conflict, but that doesn't need to be grenades going off. That can just be somebody who decides, I'm going to finally move out of my parents' basement, or I'm going to finally ask this guy out. Like, that is a moment of stress and a moment of conflict that person needs to then address in some way. And we typically like our protagonists to protag, to like actually go out and do stuff. But that's where thinking about in the world, and I think this is also where, for all the world building stuff that I do, all the storytelling stuff that I do, I'm always stressing we're always just one step away from putting the book down or turning away from the screen, and we're right back in our world, right? So there needs to be some link, there needs to be some sort of connection. And the idea of there could be a world that seemed hopeless, and then there's something that changes, a regime falls, and now you've got hope. Right. And the question is, what are you going to do with this? And that can also be crippling. That could be really, really difficult to navigate. Like, what am I going to do now that I don't have anyone telling me I can't do all of those things? Right. So I think that's really what I'm always looking for with the world building process and character creation, is that everybody has strengths and weaknesses. There are certain aspects of the world that work well. There's certain, for some people, they don't work well for other people. And just trying to, it's like what Steve was talking about before, just that subjectivity. When you're telling a story, you are taking a single perspective and saying, this is how this character or this protagonist feels about it in this moment, right? I think one of the great, in terms of world building too, it's a little bit passe. We started off talking about George R.R. Martin, right? But the idea that by the time we get to the 4th book in that series, we start getting the perspective of the Lannisters, right? And they're like, oh, well, we're not evil. We're just that's the way the world works. The world's cutthroat. And if you're not cutthroat,
pragmatic.
Yeah, we're very pragmatic about it, right? So I think that's another sort of interesting way, is if you could have an anti-hero, or you could have, someone who is seeing through their perspective and through their lens. Oh, there's a lot of opportunity here, right? Whether that's an opportunity that we think is good or bad, right? Or we would be pro-social or anti-social, is up to the reader to sort of decide. But yeah, that's where I always tell my students, and I have pretty good results with it, that they've got a great idea for a world because they've got this story they want to tell. And I'm like, you should be able to tell dozens, hundreds of different stories if you've developed your world correctly. And they will often find that the story that they were starting off with is not the most interesting story to be told in that world, which I always find to be greatly gratifying. I'm like, yeah, see, follow the process. It works.
The old octopus on the mantelpiece problem.
Yeah.
The first thing I thought of when you mentioned A Song of Ice and Fire, Trent, is the difference between the mainline Song of Ice and Fire Game of Thrones books or TV show versus Fire and Blood, which is just written very differently, right? Fire and Blood is supposed to be this sort of historical document explaining what happened in chronological order. And there are a bunch of different perspectives that are being woven together to, well, maybe it was this or maybe it was that. And this person said this, but they're an unreliable narrator, right? They're sort of negotiating what actually happened, versus A Song of Ice and Fire, where the character point of view is very clear, right? Arya Stark believes this. Tyrion Lannister sees this, right? And so those end up being a useful sort of spectrum to compare back and forth. And in one of our podcast episodes about simulations specifically, I used the example of the game Dwarf Fortress, which doesn't really have a narrative, right? It's all emergent based on the simulated interactions of the dwarves who live under the mountain. Now, if I'm watching those dwarves interact with one another, I could pick any specific character that lives in that world, drill down to what events have affected them, and then tell a story from their perspective. But that's categorically different than being sort of the third person omniscient God who's watching all this happen. Because, from my perspective, it's all just fact of the matter. Whatever happens, happens. I don't have a particular stake in what happens to this dwarf versus that dwarf or whatever. So the two of us, Trent and I, would talk to our students about how that perspective taking, whether you're doing this first person close, trying to understand the world through a specific individual's eyes, differs from that third person distant, where you're just kind of watching what's happening and explaining it to somebody as if there was an objective reality. Of course, our perspective is there is no such thing as an objective reality, right? All objective reality is negotiated between all of us. And that's kind of why I keep going back to this notion of our lived reality being the lens through which we make sense of what's going on around us. I used to tell my students all the time, imagine you had many different pairs of sunglasses and every one had different colored lenses. Well, which colored lenses you're wearing is going to change the way you interpret the reality around you. And I specifically was using this to talk about learning theory, whether you're a cognitivist or a situated cognitivist or a social learning theorist or whatever. That's just going to change the way you choose to act on the world. But it doesn't change the fact that there are these commonalities between all of the different ways you're looking at it. And if you're really trying to find some big capital T truth, you're going to have to look at the world through many perspectives in order to try to figure out, okay, where do these pieces actually fit together? And then as an individual acting in that world, where can I push on it to make some of these complex systems change and reverberate across the entirety of the web?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about hope as a setting, and it sounds pretty much like the consensus is hope is where you find it. Essentially, like, you know, you need to build some kind of conflict points, but they can be anything from I need to move out of my parents' basement to, oh no, the empire is evil again. We do have a video coming out about evil empires, by the way, guys. Nice. Which is why I'm thinking so much about evil empires right now. So let's talk about plot, which, you know, to your point is sort of more formative when we're talking about hopeful spec fic. Stephen, what are your thoughts on this? What are the kind of, what plot arcs do we see? What plot arcs are working? What makes it feel hopeful in spec fic?
One of the things I cribbed from Trent really early upon meeting him was this notion, the equation, character plus setting equals plot. And so really what you're thinking about is, and I would tell my students this too, if we were building a world together, I'd say, okay, you've created these complex systems, you've created these continents or these countries or these townships or whatever. Well, if we just take a random person and pick them up off the ground, what is the world like for them? And if we were to drop in on an average day, what would the challenges they'd be facing? What are the kinds of things that they would really care about? It's going to matter what their class is, potentially their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, the economic distribution of this world or wealth distribution, the politics of it. And that's one of the reasons why I really loved Trent's framework for understanding these categories, these structures and substructures of a world, because it really removed you from having to think about, okay, I have character A and I want them to get to plot point B. How am I going to get them through that? And here, I think it's useful to point to the example of how the Game of Thrones TV show played itself out, which went from, you know, being a pretty thorough transmedia adaptation of the book series to being completely off the rails because it went from these characters are making decisions based on their own interests and the environment around them to these characters need to get to the end so we can finish the story, which is just moving them around like chess pieces in service of the plot, not narratively following them the way that they would naturally progress. I would compare that with something like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, where these characters are complex. They have a lot of different motivations. They are changing in response to the environment. And Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould, the two showrunners for those television shows, one of the things they really did was respect the point of view of those characters and then figured out, okay, Walter White starts in this condition. He makes this decision. How does that move him toward becoming the kind of character we imagine him being? Vince Gilligan had said, how does Mr. Chips become Scarface? Is kind of his overarching motto for what Walter White's journey might be like. But he had no idea what that journey was going to look like until they sat down and storyboarded it out and figured out, oh, here's something really interesting that is in the environment that would shape the way Walter's thinking about solving a specific problem. And that choice is going to affect everybody else in his orbit. How is it going to affect them? And I used to tell my students, this is sort of like a pinball machine. You pull the little crank or the spring back, you let it go, and then watch where the pinball hits. And all of those ricochets around the inside of the machine are ultimately going to be determinative of where the plot goes. So I don't think about plot arcs as being predefined in this context. I think that they have to be very deliberately created by virtue of watching from the perspective of a given character, using that equation of character plus setting equals plot, that you're not going to start with the plot and work backward to your character. You're instead going to be thinking about, okay, where in the world is this taking place? What scale, what scope, what is the sequence of events? And how is this specific person going to react to those things? And maybe you'll be surprised as you watch the points of tension emerge that they don't go the way you expected them to go. And that produces more interesting storytelling than if you said, well, I want Walter White to become Scarface, therefore I'm going to make every single decision in service of that goal of him becoming Scarface.
Yeah, absolutely. I just need to share this from the chat. Katoy Boy says, that's the best explanation of the problems with the end of Game of Thrones I've ever heard. So a lot of appreciation from the chat here.
I would just, if I could just throw on at the end of this, I mean, one of the things that I'm always doing too, and we'll do, like I typically do a three act structure, you know, I'll say, give me 5 scenes in a 3 act structure, you know, and that's the rapid story prototyping. But one of the things that I'm always pushing on students is failures and setbacks and protagonists who don't get what they want. I think a lot of people who are into big, you know, open world RPGs and things like that, you know, digital RPGs, we're used to this sort of like 45-degree angle where the character just keeps leveling up, getting more and more powerful.
Power fantasy, yeah.
Power fantasy, right. As opposed to, no, you know what I mean? Like you did, and this is why I use tabletop role-playing games. How many times have you had a handful of dice and you shake them and you somehow fail, right? You're like, what do you mean? I had 8 6s. Like, what? How did I not fail? And then the reverse, when you roll 1 die and you get the nat 20, right? And it's like, I never should have been able to do that, right? So those are the things too that I like to bring in, those moments of surprise. And I think this is also part that goes back to some of the sort of kernel of world building, is allowing yourself to be surprised by things that would be a logical outcome, rather than trying to be like the immaculate architect where everything lines up perfectly. Our world doesn't make sense. Our world does not line up perfectly. And it's kind of hard to do, which is why the card deck, you shuffle, you know, you can shuffle the cards or you can use dice, right? Whatever. So you stop becoming the designer and you become the interpreter of a world, right? I think is an important step.
It's a lot like tarot, really. Like if you were going to deal out tarot cards and interpret them, that's often how I think about world building and storytelling. Is I use the system, set it all up like dominoes and knock it down and watch what happens. And Trent, why don't you, I don't know if this is going to be too lengthy, but why don't you do the story about the 2 different classes you had? One of them with the student who had that epic moment of running in and being the savior versus the student who was building the robot and had a negative outcome. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Right. So in these tabletop role-playing games, so one class that I taught, normally I have everyone playing in the same world. And this time I had them choose whatever they would. So one group was playing Blades in the Dark, one group was playing Vossen, one group was playing Mutant Year Zero. I can't remember what the other group was playing, but there was this, one of these students, I'll just keep it as short as I possibly can. They were playing Tales from the Loop, which is sort of like Stranger Things, right? Kids in this alternate 80s in Scandinavia. Kids on bikes, right? And the plot arc was sort of like another 80s throwback, Short Circuit, or maybe that was 90s, right? You have the adorable robot, whatever. So they find this adorable robot who's trying to escape the evil lab, but like his battery is running out and they need to go get him like a supercharged battery or whatever. So it's classic sort of like Spielberg, cops are chasing and they're running, and whatever. And they finally get into the lab and they fake their way into the lab. And the young woman she was like the tinker. And she had like 8 dice in that system. Just any 6 is a success. And she had 8 dice where like the pressure's on, and she failed the roll, right? And the entire class sort of gasped, right? Like, oh my, how did that happen? And then she actually got a little teary-eyed, like, I can't believe my character didn't do the thing, right? But then she, wrote this story in which the final scene was told from that character's mother's perspective, who went out to the shed and found her son late at night tinkering, and he was telling himself, like, if I ever am in that situation, I will not fail again, right? And it's like, oh, well, this now becomes an origin story for Tony Stark or something like that, right? It was a massive failure that turns into a huge character moment of change and development, right? So it's a case in which if it happens and it's all happy, right, it's like you actually get less mileage out of that than having the character be disappointed and, frustrated and then thinking, okay, well, now I got to do this, right? Like this happened or this didn't happen. And then I always say too, like if your story ends on a Wednesday, you have to ask what happens on Thursday morning, right? What did your character pick themselves up and get out of bed. That's why I always say never kill your characters, because it's much crueler to keep them alive. You know, what happens that next day? You know what I mean? Like, you always need to be thinking. And then on the other end, before the story starts, what happened the day before? What happened the day before that? As a good storyteller, you need to be thinking through both ends, right? Where you're just picking, sort of like the world being, you know, a scope in a moment of time. It's the same thing for a story. This is just a moment in somebody's life. It happens to be an important moment, but they need to have a life on either end of what you're actually going to tell the story for it to feel authentic and for it to feel real.
Yeah. And I think that because we're on the topic of hope, I think that often is where the hope is.
Mm-hmm.
It's the tomorrow will be better than the today. Even if we end, you know, especially with shorts, but even with novels, it tends to be very tight, right? You come in when stuff's already happening, you go out, like the denouement is very small, right? So I think often the hope is through the lens of the ending.
Yeah.
And all this terrible stuff happened, but if it looks like the future is hopeful, that's a hopeful story. And you often can't tell if a story is going to be hopeful until you've already got to the end of it and you view things through the lens of that ending.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. One of the things that I do too, I draw a box on the board, like with a cross in it, and say, okay, on one axis, I want you to have at the very, this is what I have them look at for their final scene. Did your character get what they wanted when they very first started? And then how satisfied are they by getting that, right? So we have stories in which people get what they want, and then it's a hollow victory, right? You have people who don't get what they want and realize they should have never wanted that at all, right? Like, that was something that they shouldn't have been doing, right? This is the assassin who decides not to kill their target and then realizes, oh, I've been in the business all along, right? And that whole idea that it's not a light switch, but it's a sort of a grid, right? Where you can find yourself. And then there's also cases like, well, I don't quite know how they would feel about that, right? And I'm like, all of that is better than the Disney happy ending, unless you're writing a story for children, you know, or you're writing a story where you want it to be very cut and dried. But most of the time, you know, it's like, how often do we get something that we think we wanted, and then you find out it's not all it's cracked up to be? And then you're exactly right, Janet. Then you look back and be like, well, how did I even get to this moment? And then that's where you start to cast whether it's a positive or a negative or hopeful or, you know, whatever it is. But I think that idea too, that I remember when I first started writing fiction, I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop. One of the instructors there, I can't remember which one it was, said everyone needs to at least have the capacity to change, right? And that's where even if they're really rotten people, this is the Darth Vader story, right? Like, even if they're really, really rotten people, you need to give them the capacity to change. And then if they choose not to change, then maybe that's a tragedy, right? Like, maybe, you know, it's a bad, you know, it's a sad story or whatever. But then you get that uplifting, like, even Darth Vader is not, you know, beyond because of the love of his son or whatever, right? I hate spoilers for.
I think international spoilers line has passed on that one.
Okay,
I think we're
good.
okay. Yeah,
Good.
It's been a minute.
All right.
Yeah. How about, so we've talked about character, we've talked about event a little bit. We haven't really talked about the other two of the mice quotient. And forgive me, my writing teacher is very hot on the mice quotient, so this is a sort of favorite tool of mine for framing plot. What do you think? Can you have hopeful milieu stories? Can you have hopeful investigation stories? Are those plot types that lend themselves to hopeful spec fic?
I would say, yeah. I mean, like, as a writer and as a sort of a narrative designer, because I work with a lot of students who are not writing fiction, they're doing illustration, animation, and game design. I think it comes back to that question of the individual perspective and where people find things to be hopeful about, right? And that's where someone might find something that's hopeful that somebody else would not find hopeful. And that's why you write from two different perspectives, right? That's, you know, that's the whole point of even playing a tabletop role-playing game in a group. Each of your 4 characters or 5 characters are going to look at those scenes in different ways. And this is one of the things that I emphasize in the class in which I do tabletop role-playing games, is the adventure will happen, right? Or the scenario will happen. And then they all have to write about it from their characters' perspectives. And they get to focus on the things that their characters thought were most important, right? And then they read each other's stuff. And it's like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't, you know, my wizard would have never thought that the barbarian was having a crisis of confidence in that moment, you know, or whatever it is. And I'm like, right, see, this is the whole point, is that even if the 3 of us went on a road trip, we would remember it differently. We would recall it differently. Things would stick out differently. So I think that even in a really, really great, I mean, I would imagine maybe horror, you know, like a horror story that's supposed to be, you know, I was just watching, I think it's the Cabinet of Curiosities. That's the
Yeah.
Guillermo del Toro series. And that's sort of one of those things where if I'm watching something and the character is irredeemably bad and it's a horror story, I'm like, oh, we just got to wait till he gets it, right? And like, sure enough, at the end,
we know where this is going. Yes,
we know where this is going, right? It's like, I guess it's the joy of like being, can you figure out where it's going? But you know, if you're not going to deliberately make an example of the lousy character who gets the bad ending, then I think that there's always opportunity for people to change their mind. And I mean, it's the same thing for us. At any point, I could just be like, you know what, I'm going to get in the car and drive to Mexico. You know what I mean? I could do that. I probably won't, right? Depending on how my kids are acting. But it's like we always have those options on the table. And it just kind of depends on how you're trying to craft your life. And then that is what a good story feels like, is how somebody in that world, they don't know they're a fictional character, right? They're trying to make decisions that are going to craft their life in a certain way. And I think that there's always those moments in which it's like, I always think too, like with students when talking about this issue of failure, is if you applied to 10 universities and you didn't get into the one that you really had your heart set on, what do you do? You know what I mean? Like, are you going to, wait a year and try again? Or because just hitting pause doesn't work? Or do you go to a different university and try and make the most of it? Or you know what I mean? Or do you get involved with areas that'll make your application that stronger the next time around, right? Those are all choices. And it kind of depends on where, or, like a child moving is always kind of like a YA or on the younger YA, you're moving to a new place. And it's like, oh, well, you have the opportunity to make the best of it. And I think that that's where in everything except for the most sort of grimdark, horror kind of things, there's always like I was thinking as I was talking, like Aliens, right? Like the fact that Newt is there and has managed to survive is like, hey, there's some hope here. Like, there's a little, you're sawed off Marines and she's a little girl and she's managed to survive. We've got some hope here, right? And that may not be much, but at least it's better than nothing.
It is one of the things that I find fascinating about horror. And one of the reasons why I've always struggled with it is because I never really enjoyed when the ending was going to be predictable from moment one, right? Like, here's the bad guy. This is what's going to happen. I'm just waiting 90 minutes or 2 hours or whatever to get to that point. But there are some really interesting counterexamples to that. Like The Haunting at Hill House, I think, is a really interesting piece of media because it is hopeful, even though it has tragedy laced throughout it. And I recently watched the show DTF St. Louis, which is a tragic sort of story. But even that has a kind of melancholy hope associated with it too. It all just comes down to perspective. And in that specific example, I won't spoil the ending for anyone, but it does end with exactly what Trent is describing, where the character gets something that they didn't know whether or not that's what their goal was. And then you as the audience are left to reflect on how he felt about that and what different choices he might have made along the way. I actually think the movie I Saw the TV Glow is a good example of that, where it has a very sad ending. But the point of that is to get the audience to think through, what choices am I making in my life?
Yeah.
And am I making choices that will lead me down a tragic path, or will they lead me down some path that includes more hopefulness or happiness at the end? And it really is supposed to push you to like make better decisions in some way.
I was just going to jump in there real quick to say, like, one of the other evil things that I do as the professor game master, right, is if someone there's always young men who want to have his parents were killed and now he's out for revenge, to find the man. So it's like, okay, act 1, scene 1, you find the man. He's right there, right? What are you going to do? Well, he's right there. I guess I kill him. Okay, he's dead. Now what? Right? Like, you got what you wanted. But now it's Thursday, right? You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, so now what do you do when your whole life has been built about revenge? What do you do on Thursday when you succeed on Wednesday, right? It's a really cool thing to do.
That's the Andor situation for Cyril Karn, right? Cyril gets what he wants, and then, watch it and you'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So, lots of interesting thoughts here about plot arcs and, can horror be hopeful as well? Let's talk a little bit about our world, because of course this is really
I thought we were being hopeful.
Actually, do you know what, there is a question that I want to address because it kind of popped up in the chat as well. How do we make it feel naive? Sorry, how do we make it feel hopeful without it feeling naive or saccharine? Trent, you mentioned the Disneyfication. And that is always a danger, especially if you're using a hopeful aesthetic like cozy, for example. So how can we handle this? What are your thoughts? Stephen, why don't you kick us off?
I guess my initial thought is being honest about what kinds of decisions your characters would make and not just forcing them into this Pollyanna-ish box where they're inevitably going to have a happy ending because we decided from the very beginning they're going to have a happy ending. And again, taking that step back and saying it's not really about one perspective. If I'm world building before we get to the point of figuring out what the plot is going to be, there will be tension. I mean, even for somebody who's happy-go-lucky, there is tension. I guess Ted Lasso might be the one example I can think of where that's not really the case. But even that, to me, even if I think parts of it are really well written, I think fits strangely in the era in which we live, where that naivety feels removed from reality. And this may just be a function of the environmental context in which you're consuming that media, where something that you just need something lighthearted to be able to get through the day because it's intended to be saccharine and make you feel better, right? Like, people love candy. That doesn't mean that's what you should eat all the time. And I think and there's nothing wrong with having candy in the world. It's just that can't be the entire diet, or else you really do end up in this place of, well, what is the point of this? And Trent and I just recorded an episode for next week of our podcast about Star Wars. And this is not the specific question we addressed, but it was sort of embedded in a lot of what we talked about, which is the diversity of Star Wars media and whether these more saccharine things undermine the less saccharine things. And I think the answer just becomes, it's helpful to have a lot of variety, because then depending on the context in which you're consuming that media, you're ultimately going to be able to get what it is you need emotionally from that. So I think if I'm thinking about hope without making it naive or saccharine, I think it comes back to what Trent has been saying about perspective, and that hope may be just a small spark that then feeds into the notion that the world can be better than it is today. It doesn't have to be that the protagonist gets everything they wanted and everything works out and there's a happy ending. I think a lot about George R.R. Martin's response to J.R.R. Tolkien with respect to the end of Lord of the Rings, where I don't even think that the end of Lord of the Rings is particularly saccharine. I mean, it's tragic in its own way. Frodo doesn't exactly get everything he wants, but the notion being that, okay, Aragorn becomes king and ascends the throne. Well, what happens the day after that? Does everything stay peaceful forever? Because that seems unlikely. And
he has very little experience of being a king. Right? Like, his CV is quite lacking in that department.
Yeah, exactly.
So, discuss.
Exactly.
So, like, yes, you can have, and this goes back to something I said earlier, where life is just full of peaks and valleys, and you're deciding where in that sort of sine wave function am I going to set my story so that either it ends on a high note or ends on a low note, and really what are the benefits of that? I think a lot about the affordances of a given story world. So if I'm having my students build the world, what are the affordances of the environment you've created for teaching somebody some lesson? And you'll notice that the way Trent and I discuss this is not in the monomyth Joseph Campbell, like, hero's journey way. Like, I think that's a really silly way to frame a story, because it starts at the presumption you're going to end up with a specific outcome. I think it's much more interesting and valuable to step back and say, okay, what kinds of outcomes are available here, and what is going to be the most informative or helpful to the audience that I'm writing for, regardless of medium, to get them where. Is it supposed to be a power fantasy? In that case, maybe you do want it to end on this sort of naive, hopeful, saccharine note. Maybe you don't. Like, it really depends. Like, what is your instructional or your creative goal with producing this media? And to make it feel less that, you really just have, I think, you know, to Trent's point, don't just kill your characters at the end, or don't give them a simple out for a thing that is actually complex, because all of our emotions are actually complex, and we want things that are often self-contradictory, where we think we want one thing and we realize we actually want another, or our goal was never really well founded, or there was some piece of information we didn't have and wish we did in the end. So just struggle with that, sit in that, marinate in the complexity of these complex systems, and let them sort of tell you what the correct answer would be for the audience you're writing for. I don't know, Trent, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I always like in stories too is, so going back to Jana, what you'd said, that you never really quite understand how a story works until you're at the end of it, and then you go back and look at it. And I'm a huge fan of stories, you know, so what I'll do when I'm doing this sort of act 1, act 2, act 3, act 1 has to present a question or a problem that is then answered at the climax, right? But really sophisticated fiction has lots of problems going on, and it's often not until the climax do you realize what was the point of all of this. Like, what was the one problem? So your character's got 10 problems, and this story resolves one of them. So can you be hopeful? Can you be happy? Yeah, but you still got 9 other problems, right? You know what I mean? So that's what you're going to do tomorrow is you've got the next round of problems to have to contend with. And this is where Philip K. Dick is one of my, I don't know if you've not read a lot of his stuff. It's very hit or miss depending on how many drugs and the quality of them he was on at that time. I like to say that I was a big Dick fan in grad school, read a lot of his stuff. But like his novel, Ubik, like, when I first read it, I had no idea. It was like a Super Bowl shot out of a cannon. Like, where is this going? You've raised 300,000 better ideas than I will ever have in my life. And then he chooses one of them. And that's where that novel goes, right? And it's like, oh, see, now that's something when I, as a writer, I'm like, I got to figure out how to do that better. That's really, really cool when it's just because that's how your life works. Are you worried about bills? Are you worried about your relationship? Are you worried about your job? Right? We've all got all these worries, and a story will typically isolate one of them. You know, at least one rises to the fore as the most, or comes to the fore as the most important one. But that doesn't mean those other ones are resolved, right? And it's the same thing. Like, oh, you got a promotion. Well, now you've got all these new responsibilities, right? You know what I mean? It's like those kinds of things. There's always a give and take. If that's where, and I mean, it's also one of those things where, yeah, sometimes you just want to play Stardew Valley. Sometimes you want to play Gears of War, right? Like it's not necessary. If that's what your goal is. I guess that's what I'll end on this. Is it's saying being both a world builder and a writer, so much of it is about intentionality. And you don't even always know what your intention is until you've gotten further down the line. And then you go back, and this is the art of revising, right? It's like, oh, this is turning out to be kind of a cozy, hopeful story. Now I got to go back, and before I show it to anyone, pretend that's what I intended all along. That's what revision is, right? And it's like, oh, well, this is a brilliant story. Well, crap first draft, let me tell you that much, right? And then you go back and you sort of form it into whatever it is that you wound up with. And then it's like, oh, I meant that all along.
Yeah. I do just want to speak on the other side. Just to be clear, I am not contradicting what you're saying because I think it's deeply, deeply valuable. But a little bit to Stephen's point, I am a very, very severe plotter, right? Like I have a case of the plots and it's bad. So I'm not always sitting there thinking, what is this character going to do moment to moment? I will start with architecture and then I build in character experience. So to Trent's point, sometimes you get to the end of a story and you're like, oh, I didn't mean to write that at all. I have the opposite problem where I'm like, I've written it, but it's not working because I haven't gone into the character's POV and figured out why they are making the choices they're making. And that for me is draft 2 and 3. So we end up with the same thing at the end, but we've arrived there very, very differently. So for me, I've been commissioned to write this Dark Ages folk horror thing. Should be super fun. I'm looking forward to it. And somebody asked, what's the folk horror element going to be? And I said, I won't know until I know what my theme is. And I won't know what my theme is until I know what I'm playing with. But I know that it's going to be an expression of the theme because that's how folk horror works. So, it's very architect-y, but it's also thinking about, what choices am I making to get this to feel like X, Y, or Z? And then I go into the character POV and figure out how I'm going to craft a character that needs to make these choices and make them meaningful and build that into the character arc. So I just wanted to make sure that that was also said on this podcast because there's been an awful lot of looking through the character's POV and making choices that are interesting and try fail cycles. And that is all so important, but it doesn't always hit the page in that order. Right. So I just wanted to make sure there was,
absolutely.
My nonsense experience was also represented here.
Yeah, well, I'm also a heavy plotter, and I always say to my students, like, if I sit down to write a story, I'm not building the whole world out for, however many days or weeks or years, and then figuring out what's the best perspective, because I'm a pretty seasoned storyteller. Like, I already have kind of understand all of this in the back of my head, as storytellers have forever, right? But this is where, as being an educator, right, trying to teach people who maybe don't have those instincts, here are some ways, and maybe your first instinct isn't always the best, especially if they've not consumed. I mean, I'm working with a lot of STEM students, and they've not read broadly. They played a lot of video games, but they've not read broadly. They've not watched a lot of interesting media. So that's where it's like, oh, you should be thinking about, rather than just making Gears of War 17, You should be thinking about how can we take genres and turn them upside down, or, have lots of different perspectives. And I think once you do that enough, then, I mean, like, even pros have to practice shooting free throws, or whatever it is. But there becomes a time in which it's like, well, that's kind of baked in now. That's part of the muscle memory. And that's what I'm trying to get students to do. Stephen has a great, I mean, I don't think it's totally original to him, but this whole, I want students to ask better questions. It's the same kind of thing. Like if you're an instructor, you want your students to ask better questions at the end of your class. And it's sort of the same thing when you're looking at world building and writing instruction. I want you to be coming up with more interesting, more complex, more realistic stories and worlds, right? And what I find is that the beginning to end cycle is shorter once you start to develop those kinds of critical thinking muscles, in which you don't need to run through 15 different perspectives. You know why this one is the one that you want to go with. Whereas if you're 13 and you're writing a story, right? You know what I mean? Like you probably haven't thought about anything other than the one. And that one is very much
like, I'm killing my mentor, but I don't know why.
Right, exactly. But that's where I say too that, like, you can go into the bookstore. We still have those some places in the United States, as opposed to just being on Amazon. But there's whole shelves of how to write fiction, right? Whole shelves, because you just need one if they actually worked, right? Like you would only need one book. Here's how you do it. But the reality is that writing advice is only you apply it to a specific kind of story at a specific time, and it works. And then it is completely irrelevant to every other kind of story that other people might be writing, right? So that's where the real skill is, being able to identify in your own work, where am I doing this where I need a little help, right? You know what I mean? Like that is just as hard as writing a story to begin with, figuring out. And that's why we do drafts, and that's why we do, sharing with other people to get feedback, all that kind of stuff, because you don't know what you don't know. But yeah, so that's where, and I always say there's a million pieces of writing advice. Most of them are going to be wrong for the story that you're working on, and you got to figure out which ones are right, which is, again, a skill in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about this, which is where I was going to go, but then I got distracted by naivety. No, beg your pardon. Sorry. This. How can world building help us understand our own world better? Which is, of course, what the World Building Workshop is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, give us the pitch.
That is a perfect segue. I had been thinking as Trent was talking that I wanted to bring up the first portion of the World Building Workshop, because we in that book are specifically writing to educators of all kinds, right? The collaborative world building for writers and gamers is sort of more broadly for anyone interested in gaming and writing, world building, etc. Whereas the World Building Workshop was specifically requested by MIT Press for the purpose of helping educators figure out, how do you help learners make the world better, right? How do you help them figure out what it takes to change a world, to understand complex systems? And we opened the book with an anecdote of something I used to pitch to my students whenever I teach my game systems class or my interactive storytelling class. I took a coffee cup and I would bring it into class and tell them, this is a coffee cup. Now you tell me, how did it get here? What is it full of? How did that coffee get into the cup? Where did the logo come from? Et cetera, et cetera. And just walking them through, which I think became a little bit clearer after COVID had happened. And even now there's the events taking place in the Middle East that are affecting supply chain. So it was a little bit clearer. But the reason why I would do this is to get them to understand all the points of interaction in the world that would result in that coffee cup being in my hand in that classroom in that moment. And so I used world building pretty deliberately in the same way you were just describing, Janet, about the starting as a plotter and just figuring out like, okay, what do I want to say? And then figuring out the characters and their motivations, whatever. Because it's so similar to the instructional design work that I would do, where you start at your learning objective, figure out how am I going to assess whether or not my learners have learned the thing I need them to. And then I go back to the beginning and chart out what is their journey going to look like from point A to point Z. That's similar to my creative writing process. And I had a discussion with a friend who's a poet who said, oh, I do the exact opposite thing. I just start writing and figure out where it goes. And I'm like, yeah, neither is better or worse than the other. They're just different strategies. And you will inevitably have to do both eventually. So when I think about world building for our world, I really do come at it from that lens that, okay, I want my learners to understand this thing about reality. How am I going to help scaffold them to making these realizations that will ultimately lead to them doing things in the real world that will make a difference? And we in the US just had May Day. And so people are thinking about labor activism and unionization and what are workers' rights and those sort of things. If I were creating a course about worker rights or labor activism, I would be starting there and thinking about, okay, what kind of project could I have my students world build that would encourage them to research some of the historical events that led to labor activism or that are involved with labor activism? How would I get them to recognize the way different substructures of the world interact with labor? So how does government versus economic structures versus culture and social relationships, how do all of those things interface with that singular concept of labor activism? And then how am I going to talk to my students about it to ask them questions that get them to ask better questions themselves when they leave the classroom? So for me, world building, whether it's speculative fiction or we're talking about actual historical events or current events, it's all the same to me. We're storytelling for everything all the time. And it's just a question of where are we isolating themes, and then how are we tracing those themes across all of the different elements of the world we're building from beginning to end.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say too that one of the things that's really important, and I think I focused more when we were writing this book, just through our discussions, is sort of tackling assumptions and also generalizations, because our world is so heavily complex that we use generalizations just as a way to process the massive amounts of data. So we may say, oh, well, people in the United States like American football, people in Brazil like soccer, Canadians like hockey, right? Those are sweeping generalizations that aren't too damning, right? I mean, but and they're also kind of generally true, but you can go to any of those countries and find people who don't care at all, right? So then as you are at your big world level, right, you're going to make generalizations about the way that societies, about the way that certain people are, the kind of foods or their cultures or whatever. But as you start zooming down and being like, oh, well, the Pacific Northwest is really different than the Southeast of the United States, different climate, different patterns of immigration, right? So same country, but different worlds kind of, right? And then as you keep zooming in, and I always say, I live in Rochester, New York, which is in New York State, but it is not at all like New York City, right? We have two completely different worlds. And you can say, well, what are some of the generalizations that we would make about Rochester, right? But just knowing that as you are going further and further down, you're always getting more and more specific. And the generalizations are always kind of flimsy, right? The other part of it is that, thinking about when there was the chemical spill in Ohio, I'm never too far away from the role play aspect of this, that you've got somebody there who is the local sheriff, the local fire department. You've got somebody who is a resident who has no idea what's going on. You've got federal disaster response teams, right? And one of the things that I've done on my campus too, to work with some different faculty, is to say all those people are going to look at that scenario through different perspectives, what needs to get done. And this is why, it's the classic, the sheriff can't agree with the guy, the bigwig who flew in from DC or whatever. And it's like, oh, well, it's because they've got different perspectives on what it is that needs to get done, what they value, whether they know the local people or not. And it just becomes this way of isolating a moment in time and being like, let's just construct real quickly, what do we think the social forces are? Who are all the people who are in this world, right? What was it like before we got here? What's it going to be like after? So using those same concepts of scope, sequence, and perspective. What's the place? What's the time? How fuzzy are both of those borders? And then who's in that moment, and what would be all the different ways that we would be perceiving what's going on. So leveraging all the gaming stuff, right, and making it really flexible. There is not a right or wrong answer. There are sort of best practices and what you would hope someone would do, right? What a professional would do when they find themselves in a situation, rather than binary, you do this, you don't do that.
Which is how we ended up with the subtitle for the book too, about empathy and critical thinking, right? That the idea here isn't just you're world building because it's fun, although it can be fun and engaging, but really it's you're taking people's perspectives to understand the world better so that you can make better decisions as a person who lives in that world. And to go back to where you were starting, Trent, with essentialisms and stereotypes, one of the things we mention in the book is that we want our learners to think more like scientists and less like lawyers, which, if there are any lawyers in the chat, sorry, it's probably going to make you upset. But The reality being that lawyers typically start at a conclusion and then look for evidence that backs up that conclusion, because they're arguing on behalf of a person or a company or whatever. They're in court and their job is to prove a specific thing. Whereas a scientist is thinking about all the different possibilities and basically falsifying them to decide what is that capital T truth. And so we're trying to use this sort of empathetic perspective taking to get our learners to think more about, something we had said earlier, not framing things as good guys and bad guys, but people. And people believe all kinds of crazy things or not so crazy things. How do we make sense of how they make sense of the world? And we repeatedly go back to this notion of putting on somebody else's shoes, where if you were that sheriff or you are that bigwig for DC, why do you believe the thing that you do? And if we're going to survive the ecosystem, the online social media ecosystem that's been created, the only way you're going to be able to do that is to drill down and say, this is why I think this person might believe what they do. And we need to be able to form a common language to work out what the objective reality is so that we can solve a real problem. And some of those problems are small and they might be interpersonal. Some of them are climate change and some of them are nuclear war. And so there are all these other massive issues we need to contend with as humans. You might as well start with, how do Trent and I see the world differently and how do we see it the same? And that's really why we go from that macroscopic 40,000 foot view down to the individual corner store where you're running into your neighbor and having a conversation about how you don't like the bushes they just put in on their yard, right? Like all of these things are interconnected at some level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other aspect of this question kind of leads us to the grand metaphor, right? The fact that, Dune is actually about oil and world powers, right? And these kinds of things. I was privileged to be on an awards panel last year. And so I read a hell of a lot of books that had just been released, which is not usually my entire reading diet, but this is what we had to do. That was the job. And I was so struck by the number of decolonizing narratives, colonization narratives, those kinds of things, all in second worlds, because these are safe spaces to explore those questions. And they are safe spaces to present and fun. There's a little spoonful of sugar there to encourage audiences to consider the experiences that were lived in a way that doesn't just pile guilt on. It makes it possible to see them and understand them without the personal emotional implications, which allows you to see them as problems that need to be solved in a way. As well as an exercise, to your point, in empathy. What do you think is the role of world building within that space, and how far can we push it before it becomes a problem in its own right?
That's a good question. Yeah, so this is what I would say too to this, right, is it does come back to we are all actors, we all have agency in our world, right? So even being able to identify what are things that we think need to be changed. And then, like, if they're sitting right next to me, we've got someone who is like a Christian nationalist, right? What they think the United States should be in 10 years is radically different than what I think the United States should be in 10 years. Well, I can try and, convince them or talk to them, to come over my view, same thing. But really, at the end of the day, I'm going to be making the decisions. I have the agency to make the decisions in my life to try and bring about a future that I want to see, just like this other person will do that, trying to make a future that they want to see. And this is where one of the things specifically, I'm a huge Tolkien fan too. It's very easy to fall into that trap of saying orcs are irredeemably evil, right? That's, if you see an orc, just kill it because it's irredeemably evil, right? Well, that's not that far away from being like Canadians are irredeemably evil, right? Like you see a Canadian, you just gotta kill them. And it's like, that is problematic thinking, right? And that's where lots of other, we've seen this before with dragons, or trolls or orcs. It's like, oh, it can talk and it has feelings and it's sentient, you know what I mean? And it has its own opinions. And I think that that's where I like to see that more in fiction as well, that the colonization, there's often a lot of assumptions that also go into that as to what a colonized culture, the culture that is receiving the outsider versus, the cultures that are going in. There's in a lot of sloppy world building and in a lot of sloppy fiction writing, it's all very binary, right? In which it's like good guys,
Yes.
bad guys. I've never watched the Avatar movies, and hopefully I'm never going to. But that the reason why I never have is because it just feels so stupidly binary, right? And it's like these things should not be so cut and dried, right? One of the things, this is a weird example that I'll use sometimes in Dances with Wolves, which is a problematic movie in some ways, but they've got, the Western marching army, and they've got the guy Spivey, who is, really mean, and he tortures a dog or something like that. And then they've got the commander who knows that guy's a jerk and kind of feels bad about what they're doing. Well, when the natives attack, they both die, right? They both die right next to each other. And it's like, yeah, that's the way the world works, right? You know what I mean? Like the good guy just doesn't get off just because he's got the right attitude or the right perspective. And I think that I always appreciate those kinds of moments. Again, I keep coming back to unexpected, but then totally believable. Like that's how it actually would work. And if you can make your fiction and you can make a world that presents those kinds of moments, and you can tell stories about, well, I wanted the good guy to win. Like this is the whole thing with the first novel, Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire, right? You would think, again, spoiler warning, you would think that Ned Stark would bring his brand of governance and morality and whatever to corrupt King's Landing and reform it. And the exact opposite happens. He is a naive fool who gets his head cut off, right? Because he does not change to adapt to the rules of that world, right? And that's where, that was super shocking, super surprising. That's why the show got, I think, so much energy behind it, or something like The Red Wedding as well. Like these are shocking things. And then you sit back, like going back to Janet, what you were saying, you look back and you're like, well, of course, why would they have gone? Why would they have been so naive, right? And it's like, oh, because they're from the North and they didn't expect to get backstabbed, and it's like, oh, that makes for really compelling, really interesting storytelling. It surprises you. And then when you run the tape back, you're like, why didn't I see it coming? Of course, that's what would happen, right? So that whole, and I think that's where, again, that idea that our world is bumpy and complex and weird, and then you hit a certain age or have a certain moment where you're like, I've been thinking about this all wrong, right? We have that happen all the time, and it's a real trick, a real good trick to pull off in fiction writing and storytelling, where the surprise is the thing where you're like, oh, it seems like I should have seen it coming, but the storyteller set it up in which, I didn't.
Yeah, I just flagging this user question, which is, this viewer question, which is exactly that. How can you add surprise to a story so it doesn't feel contrived? And clearly, in both of those examples that you shared, it's setting up story expectations that get scuppered by reality, essentially. Like real people don't work like that. The world is not cinema universe. This is not how these things happen.
The China Mieville books, both Perdido Street Station, which is one of the ones that I absolutely adore, and The Scar are both intentionally about setting up expectations only to then foil them, right? Like he's doing that on purpose in terms of genre conventions and character conventions and good guys and bad guys. But those are novels in which I could just kind of sit around and pull apart all day, because it does it so well in both of them, and that it frustrates the genres that they're sort of in. And Perdido Street Station, he just like deliberately throws it all in a blender, right? And just is like, it's all, it's like, we don't live in genres. We live in a world where it's all mixy, messed up all the time. We use genres, we use disciplines to make sense of the world, but that's not actually how we experience it, as a slurry, right? You know what I mean? Where it's all over the place. And we put up these boundaries and these taxonomies in order to better make sense of it, not because that's the way the world actually works. And I think that that's another, once again, things that are really tricky to do in your world building is how do you make it so it's not a taxonomy and there's these bleeds in which, why would anybody ever want slavery? Well, you know what I mean? Like there was a place and a time where there's an economic incentive to do that, and they didn't have the same moral framework, and everybody was doing it, and it's like that is a period in our own history, even though it's hard to get our head around now. Back then, that was the normal. That was the normal thing. So again, it's like the world is endlessly complex. This is another thing. We've never been to another dimension. We've never been to another planet. We've never met any aliens. So all of the stories that we've ever consumed have been written by human beings who are imagining different circumstances, right? And just kind of saying either whether it's super realistic, like literary fiction is just a genre of fiction, just like horror, just like fantasy, right? It's taking its own conventions of how you build a reality. And just because they don't have speculative elements doesn't mean that they're any more real or true than stories with dragons and spaceships and all that kind of stuff.
I would shout out to Vince Gilligan again for Pluribus, which is it's related because you had brought up colonization as well, which I think actually when they had started writing the plot or storyboarding out what was going to happen in that, it was before AI was a thing, although you can read that into it as well. But this notion that they essentially wanted to look at the question, what happens if you do I Dream of Jeannie, or you create this environment where a person gets everything they ever wanted, except it's not actually making them happier, it's just making them more miserable. And the reason it makes them miserable is because Carol, the main character, has to contend with all the downstream consequences of what happens in, essentially Invasion of the Body Snatchers, except everybody's nice to you. It's what happens if you're given everything you ever wanted. And the reason why I find that to be a really useful example is because Vince Gilligan does the same thing, where he builds up all of these conventions or tropes that we've become to expect from television and makes it seem like that's going to be a big climax, and then completely undercuts it by basically saying, yeah, that didn't matter at all. What really mattered was this thing over here you weren't paying attention to. And I'll avoid spoiling any of it because I know there's only been one season and I'm sure many people still haven't watched it yet. But there are a number of times throughout that first season where you think something is going to happen and then it's completely subverted because he was playing on the idea that you would expect that thing to happen. And that gets back to what you were saying really early on in this conversation, Trent, about working within genres to figure out what is the thing that your audience is going to assume it will occur as a result of including this. Yeah. And then what can you do to play with it and make it more interesting and maybe shift their attention a different way or do some sleight of hand that's going to get them to think more deeply about the consequences of this stuff. And again, because Pluribus is about colonization, it really does position you to think about, well, I don't know, maybe for some of the people in this show, colonization is a positive for them. And you really have to deconstruct, why is it a positive for them? Why isn't it? What are the downstream consequences for these other people who aren't Carol? And how is Carol going to persuade them to join her perspective about whether this is good or bad? And I just think that ends up being this, I know it's common for Trent and I to go back to all these examples and just keep pointing at them and say, go watch this, go play this, go do whatever. But that's the only way, I think, is getting those contrasting cases that you're going to be able to identify what you can be doing as an author or a creator or an artist that's going to controvert all of those other things that are happening in media in ways that are unexpected or are somehow going to tell a deeper story than maybe otherwise you would.
That's right. I would say, too, that one of the examples that I use, because hardly any students read them, are Greek tragedies. I got into a real big phase of reading Greek tragedies as well. And it's like everybody who is watching, Sophocles and Euripides and whatever, they knew Oedipus marries his mom and kills his dad. That's not the spoiler, right? You don't need a spoiler point. It's like, the thing is, like, how did that happen, right? And then it's like,
it's the Brecht question. It's not... Like tell them the story so you can show them how it happens.
So it happened. And then this is one of the things too that I love. I mean, I love Rogue One and I love Andor. And it's that same thing. And this is where I'm teaching my Star Wars Transmedia Story Worlds class for the first time in a number of years this fall. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love is in Andor, you know exactly what's happening before and you know exactly where it leads. And for them to tell such a compelling story when you already know the beginning, kind of the middle, and kind of the end is tremendous storytelling, right? It's one of those, like, try and tell, Little Red Riding Hood and make it interesting, right? We all know that story. That is a serious challenge when the people already know, as opposed to, like, this is where, some of we were walking out of one of the MCU movies and my son said something that was like, one of the things that happens in the end. Everyone's like, don't spoil it, don't you? I'm like, that's really kind of naive. You know what I mean? Like, really, you didn't expect Captain America to do the thing, right? That's like, if you're just, that's just there's sort of the fan service side, as opposed to, like, we know the good guys are going to win, right? And then the question becomes, how do you make that a rich and rewarding? And sometimes, with genres, romance novels, well, the reader wants the couple to get together in the end. And then there's the rockiness that happens in between. And then you're satisfied in the end. And the better romance writers will make it seem less and less likely that the characters will get together. and then they somehow find a way to bring them back together that doesn't feel contrived, right? And it's like, this is the difference between really good storytellers and really sort of paint by the numbers. I bought a book that told me I got to do this, this, and this, right? There's telling a story isn't that hard, really. Telling a good story is extremely hard. Telling a story that someone will pay you to tell is the hardest thing of them all, right? So this is where I'm always saying to students too, like, well, anybody can just kind of whip out a story or write 80,000 words or whatever it is. That's actually not that hard, but making it something that functions and structurally it, works. And then also we can relate to the characters. That's the trick of all of it. And it's the same thing with world building, where it's like, it doesn't matter, like this whole question of production, like just sort of like expansion is necessarily better. It's like, no, it's really not, right? It's like, if it's slop, then it's all going to be slop. Whereas you're much better off, being the architect of something that actually kind of fits and works, rather than being somebody who is like, I'm just going to write 1,000,000 words, because it's like, okay, well, you can write them. Who's going to read them? There got to be something there that draws people to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, this has been Hopeful Speculative Fiction with the amazing Trent Hergenrader and the amazing Stephen Slota. Guys, you must check out the WorldBuildingWorkshop.com. That's where you can go and find the phenomenal work these folks have collaborated on, taking world building into the real world. How can we solve the real world's problems with the skills that we have built as creatives, sideways thinkers, storytellers, and these things. Yep. So folks, thank you both so very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
And we welcome questions too. So, I mean, this is one of the things that, after we talk to people, it's like, yeah, reach out. If you got a question, you got a project. I occasionally pop in on the World Anvil Discord as well. So yeah, don't be shy.
Absolutely. And folks, make sure you take them up on that. There is a contact form on the worldbuildingworkshop.com, I believe.
Yep.
That's how they can find you. All right, guys, be checking your inbox. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
But this is not the end. Oh, no, because we have a challenge to launch, my friends. So today we have closed, I in fact just closed in the background, our Adventure April challenge. So we challenged you to write a short story or an RPG adventure, and a bunch of you did, and I'm so excited. Those are now going to go through to the judging round. I'm actually the judge for this one, so I'm looking forward to reading all of your wonderful work. And today we're launching a brand new challenge. So they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, so let's see if I can get the screen share to work. This is our challenge. Pause for dramatic effect. And there she goes! The Hitchhiker's Guide to Your World. What landmarks should someone visit? What delicacies shouldn't they miss? And what dangerous corners should they watch out for? This month, we challenge you to write an in-world travel guide for your world, or part of it. We're talking document template. We're talking exploring through POV eyes, which is absolutely something we've been talking about today. And folks, what are your first thoughts on this? Where would you go? What would you do? How would you explain your world as a travel guide? And is there something niche-y in your world that you would use as a lens to kind of show this one? I think I overwhelmed you with too many questions.
You're asking us too? Where would we start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I think the thing that I like are opinionated travel guides, right? Like, this is one of the things that, if you just tell me the things, right? There's a million things to do in every city, but I like the real personalized, like, this place isn't as good. This is a tourist trap, those kinds of things. So I think it's a good opportunity. I always like in my world building projects to give them the option of having like some really salty monks who are, somewhere off, and they're writing a story, they've got very strong opinions about everything that's going on. So yeah, and that's where, the thing too, that it's true about maps and it's true about travel guides is you can't do the whole thing, right? You got to pick and choose. And there are choices, those choices that you make about what's important and what's not, what you choose to say about it, what's worth doing. It's a lot of fun. Or like I've used in the collaborative world building book too, I talk about how we've got in D&D, right? You've got Elminster, and then you've got Volo, right? Who they're leaving marginal notes in, like, I don't agree with this at all, right? And like, I don't know where he came up with this. So having those kinds of fun sort of marginalia that may accompany your travel guide would be a lot of fun. Like maybe the official version and then the notes of the person who went and did it would be a lot of fun too, to just play up on those different perspectives, right? There's different, like not everybody would see the same event or the same site and see it in the same way. And that's also where it's like, we've got these debates now in the United States as to what does it mean when you're pulling down a Confederate monument? Well, it means very, very different things depending on where you find yourself as a citizen in the United States. And that is also something in which your fictional worlds, it should also be that way, right? And not a single place is a mono location in which everybody feels the same way about it. There are people who love Christmas. There are people who hate Christmas, right? So those are the kind of perspectives that I think would be really fun to come out in a travel guide. Nice.
So don't build a planet of hats. Give us lots of opinions. That's what I'm hearing. What about you, Stephen? What are your thoughts?
Quite similarly, the first thing I thought of was, as Trent was talking, was the notebooks from Gravity Falls, where there are a ton of marginalia that are written into them. There's a physical printed copy somewhere on my bookshelf. But the treatment of the world as an anthropologist or sociologist who's kind of trying to make sense of what's going on here. Like if they themselves are a foreign visitor to this place and trying to explain to other people the same way that if you traveled across Europe and Asia in the 1200s, what might you have seen and what would you have communicated back if you were explaining to somebody? That kind of travel guide would really appeal to me because it has these fantastical elements where the narrator is somewhat unreliable versus a strict travel brochure where you just say, yeah, go to this hotel, go to get this restaurant, whatever, where you're going to get both the opinions and some questionable things in there. I think of the way that Herodotus and Thucydides talked about history, like that there are different competing visions for what a historical document should be. That's kind of what I'd go to, is figuring out how would I explain this world as a foreigner in it to somebody else who had never been there, and then using that as a way to chart out a little bit of this fun, fictional, engaging material, as opposed to just being a rote document that explains, like a wiki, here are all the things as a catalog.
Janet, have you read Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities?
No, I haven't.
It is fantastic. So everyone should go get one. It is a fictional conversation between Genghis Khan and Marco Polo. And Marco Polo is telling Genghis Khan about because he's not seen his entire kingdom. And Marco Polo is like, I've been here, I've been here, I've been here. But he can only talk about these places metaphorically, right? So it is just a series of like usually a page, maybe 2 pages in which he's talking about a city and using it in the language of like a spider web. And the whole book is full. And it's like, he just can't keep doing this, can he? It's like, yes, he can. Like every time a new chapter, it's a new city, and it is absolutely fantastic. The metaphors, the poetry of the language, it's super, super great. And it's something that I always assign in my world building classes. So I assign it to all of your...
to the list.
Yeah, right. I assign it to all of your World Anvil listeners as well. You won't regret it.
Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities.
Yep.
I am again on this World Building Award panel and have 70 books to read right now. But when I'm done doing that, I'll read that.
It's short.
So we have some ideas for you here. Create a travel guide for a tourist, a traveling merchant, a bounty hunter, or anything else. One of my personal favorite examples that I came across recently was for the Hellenovlacs, which were a traveling people who went sort of across what was the Ottoman Empire from way up in, Albania, Bulgaria, all the way down through to Austria. And it's a guide on the road for like where to stop and where will you find the place to stop and where is dangerous and you don't want to go there and watch out for these people. And this is a good place to change your money when you need to change your money and that kind of stuff. That's amazing in-world document because it's from our world, but like just phenomenal to see the world through those eyes. That was actually the inspiration for this video, which we have that will also help you with this if you're looking for ideas, if you're looking for thoughts. And one of the things that we put in here, you'll be pleased to know, is a lot of thoughts about the POV of the writer. So who is writing this? Why are they writing this? Is this a not very truthful but very very flowery tourist guide to try and get people to come to the city? Is this a kind of brass tacks warning, essentially? But a few things about the challenge that are specific. You have 2,000 words, okay? So I would recommend not doing the entire world because you're not going to have the word count for it. choose a space in your world, and that can be a physical space, or it could be a sort of an area like the food world, right? Or the magic world or something. But choose a lens to do this through, because otherwise you're going to run out of words. And of course, we have prizes because this is a competition. So if you do not want to take part as a competition, you could turn off competitor mode and just take part as a challenge. If you would like to be a competitor, make sure competitor mode is on. You can do that through features on the website. And we have 2 all-star judges for this. David Green, who again, very, very often on the World Anvil podcast, author of Magic Maps and Mischief, will be judging the Standard League. And Mer Lafferty of all of the fame will be judging the Premier League. So we've got 2 different judges for the 2 different leagues, and both have written wonderful books that really fall into the category that we're sort of talking about. So that's going to be our prizes. We're going to give you loads of books because books are awesome and we love them. So how do you enter? Well, it's very simple. Create a document template on World Anvil. It has to be a new one. It has to be created from now on. Take a look at some real world examples if you need some inspiration. There is a bunch of ideas here, important local landmarks or culture or festivals, unmissable or very missable food could be there. Basic greetings. You might share history or even a walking tour. You might share important safety advice or travel tips. One of the other examples that we talked about was, and you guys will know the name of the thing better than me, the travel guides that were published in the States that were advising people of color where it was safe to go and not. And their name was, do you remember?
I don't remember, but I know exactly what you're talking about. They've also got a lot for LGBTQ travel as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a slightly less politically charged topic, there are a bunch of things that are just like, you can get gluten-free food here, which I can tell you is hard to do. So you can definitely look at it through the lens of a vampire or a traveling merchant or an itinerant priest. There are so many options. So folks, the challenge is now the green books. Thank you so much. I am sorry for forgetting that. There is so much food for thought here, and I cannot wait to read your wonderful entries. Please do make sure that you put them in by May the 30th. That is when we will be closing this challenge, but you have the whole of May. So guys, get writing. I want to see your travel guides. I want to explore your worlds through the documents that you submit. And of course, all of the normal roles apply. You can read them all on the page. There's more inspiration here on the page as well, so you can really dig in. And naturally, there will be conversation over on the World Anvil Discord. So that is a great place to start spitballing ideas, talking about how you're going to get your kind of great meta stuff from your world and throw it into this document and make it feel rich and explicitly extremely your world, right? Like your world in its most concentrated form. I think that's what these kinds of documents do really well. We have already a suggestion, A Vampire's Guide to Quick Bites.
Oh, very good.
I'm so here for this. So folks, that's what's going on in May. What do you think, guys? Are you going to get your students to enter this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to drop it into our class Discord immediately.
Nice.
Another recommendation: the Apple television show Widow's Bay just released, and so they have a few episodes out. But the premise seems to be that a hapless mayor is trying to get people to travel to a haunted New England island. So his whole thing is about trying to create circumstances that will dissuade or will get people to ignore all of the horror stories about this place and instead come for a visit. So. I'll give a plug to Apple TV for that. Although it's not over yet. They only have a few episodes, but I'm hooked. So
amazing. All right. Great recommendation. Thank you. And yeah, I love that as a hook. Very sinister urban horror vibes a little bit, maybe. I'm so here for this. Yeah, come to our city. You'll definitely be fine. Yep. Nothing to see here. We do, of course, have a few stickers that will be coming out. This is my personal favorite. Of course, it is the Hitchhiker's Guide. So we're really leaning in. We also have our Udan with a towel because, of course, you always need a towel so you won't panic. And we have our glorious badges, our participants badge for everyone. So anyone who takes part, competitor or challenger, will be getting this badge on their profile. And we have the winners badges as well. And gosh, aren't they snowy and beautiful? So in a nutshell, that's the May challenge. I'm so excited. I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful time writing. And it's very, very inspiring. I'm, as always, just a little bit too excited about everything. But yeah. So the fun isn't over. We are going on a raid, and our raid shout is Light Up the Forge. So shout it out when you get over to the Rookery, where they are doing, as always, splendid, splendid things. And I will see you next week for some more World Anvil fun. All right, my lovelies, have a beautiful, beautiful day. Enjoy the challenge. Grab your hammer and go world build. Bye, guys.